She sent him away on a Tuesday and he left without a word. That's the part that stays with me, not the argument, not the months of silence that came before it. The part that stays is that Everett Doane picked up his hat from the hook by the door, looked at Sylvia Crane for exactly 3 seconds, and walked out into the rain without closing the door behind him, as if he expected to come back. As if he couldn't imagine a version of this story where he didn't. He was wrong about that, but it would take a full year and a fire to find out how wrong. Sylvia Crane was 34 years old, and had been running the Broken Bow freight operation out of Laramie, Wyoming since her father died and left it to her, instead of her brother, which was the kind of decision that scandalized half the county, and made the other half very quietly relieved, because everyone knew which of the 2 Crane children had the head for numbers. Sylvia had kept the books since she was 16. She knew every route, every supplier, every driver's weakness and every competitor's rate. She had grown the operation from 6 wagons to 14 in 4 years, and she had done it without asking anyone's permission or advice, which was not something the men of Laramie had yet entirely forgiven her for. She had hired Everett Doane on a February morning, when the temperature was so far below zero, that the ink in her pen had thickened, and she had to hold the contract near the stove to sign it. He had come with a letter of recommendation from a freight broker in Denver that said, in its entirety, "He does what he says he'll do, that's rarer than it sounds." He was 38, broad through the shoulders, quiet in a way that wasn't shyness but wasn't warmth either. He answered her questions with the minimum number of words required. He did not explain himself. He did not ask about the wage until she brought it up. Sylvia looked at him across the desk and made her first assessment in under a minute. Capable, self-contained, and likely to be a problem. She was right about the first 2. She hired him because it was February, and 2 of her drivers had quit over the winter, and she had a contract with a mining company that required more runs than she could cover. She told herself it was a practical decision. She told herself she was not moved by the letter, or by the fact that he had ridden 3 days through a Wyoming winter to sit across from her desk, and answer her questions with the minimum number of words required. She was not, as a rule, moved by men. Everett went to work. He drove the northern route, which was the worst of them. 60 miles of road that turned to mud in March and ice in November, with 2 river crossings and a mountain pass that the other drivers rotated through on a schedule to avoid overuse. Everett didn't ask to rotate. He drove north, came back, turned around and drove north again. When the spring thaw made the eastern crossing impassable, he found another way through without being asked, and without reporting the change until Sylvia noticed the route on the log and asked him about it. He said the old crossing was out. He said he'd found a better one. He said he'd take her out to see it if she wanted. She said she'd take his word for it. He nodded and went back to work. He did not complain. He did not ask for credit. He did not seem to need anything from her at all, which should have been straightforward but was somehow, in a way she couldn't name, irritating. The other drivers liked him. They played cards in the evenings. He played but didn't talk much. He beat them at cards with a consistency that should have made enemies but didn't, because he never gloated, and never took more than he'd won. One of her older drivers, a man named Pettigrew, who had worked the routes for 11 years and had opinions about everyone, told Sylvia that Doane was the best freight man he'd seen since her father. Sylvia thanked him for the information and filed it away under noted but irrelevant. By summer she had started to notice things she did not want to notice. That he fixed equipment without being asked. That when the young driver she'd taken on in April got into trouble on the mountain pass, Everett had gone back for him at night without telling anyone. And only Pettigrew knew about it, because he'd been awake and seen Everett ride out. That he read, not almanacs or ledgers the way practical men read, but actual books which he kept in a saddlebag and never mentioned. She saw the spine of one once and asked without thinking what he was reading. He held it up. It was Marcus Aurelius. She said she hadn't expected that. He said most people didn't. That was the longest personal conversation they'd had in 6 months. She told herself she was observing an employee. She told herself that noticing a man's reading habits was not the same as being interested in a man. She told herself a great many things that summer, and she believed most of them right up until September, when he told her he was thinking of leaving. He said it simply, the way he said everything. Said he'd heard about a freight operation in Montana looking for someone to manage a route, that the wage was better, and he thought he might go look at it. He said it the way you'd say the weather was turning. Sylvia said that was his decision to make. She said it the way she said everything, evenly without reaction, and went back to the ledger she'd been reviewing. He left the office. She sat at the desk for 4 minutes without moving, and then told herself this was a personnel matter and she was handling it correctly. She handled it correctly by making the next 3 weeks intolerable. She did not do it intentionally. She was certain of this mostly. She reviewed his logs with a precision she did not apply to anyone else's. She questioned decisions he had made on the northern route. Decisions she had previously accepted without comment, and made him account for them in writing. She told herself she was ensuring standards were maintained before he left and a replacement needed to be brought in. She told herself it was professional. Everett said nothing for 2 weeks. He answered her questions in writing, in full, without complaint or defensiveness, which made everything worse. And then on a Tuesday in October, during a meeting that had gone longer than necessary, because Sylvia kept finding things to add to the agenda, she told him his report for the northern run had not been filed correctly, which was true but minor, and he looked at her across the desk with the same steady look he'd given her in February and said quietly, "What is it you actually want to say to me, Sylvia?" She had never heard him use her first name before. She told him his conduct was not the question. She told him she was running a business and she required complete records. She told him she had made no comment on his personal plans, and expected the same professionalism in return. He stood up, got his hat from the hook by the door, looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, and walked out into the rain without closing the door behind him. She told herself it was better this way. She told herself that for about a week. Then she stopped telling herself anything and simply got through the days. He sent a note, not an apology, not an explanation, just a forwarding address in Billings in case his final pay needed to reach him. She sent the check. She did not write anything else. She sat at her desk on the day she mailed it and thought about the way he had said, "What is it you actually want to say to me?" and felt a cold, specific anger that she recognized after a moment was not directed at him. She had been doing this thing. She had been circling something for 9 months, and then, when it moved toward a door, she had sharpened her pencil and started reviewing his logs. And he had seen it. He had seen it clearly and named it, and she had answered by citing his filing procedures, and he had put on his hat and left, and she had stood by and let him. She had been engaged once when she was 26, to a man named Carroll who worked in her father's law office. Carroll was handsome and educated and had wanted, slowly and politely and with great patience, to make her smaller. He had done it with suggestions, with concern, with a particular tone of voice that implied she was being admired even as she was being managed. By the time she understood what was happening, she had already lost 2 years, and a piece of herself she'd had to spend another year getting back. She had not let anyone close enough since to find out if the pattern would repeat. What she had not reckoned on was a man who wasn't interested in making her anything. What she had not reckoned on was Everett Doane, who drove the worst route without complaint, fixed equipment without credit, read Marcus Aurelius in a saddlebag, and asked her what she actually wanted to say to him. She thought about writing him a letter. She didn't write it. She thought about it for 3 months, through November and December, while she hired a new driver for the northern route, a competent man, adequate, nothing like, while she worked the books and managed the contracts, and did not permit herself to think about the question he'd asked her, except when she was alone and the office was quiet and there was nothing left to do but sit with it. In January the warehouse caught fire. It was not her fault, and it was not catastrophic, but it was bad. A lamp left burning near dry timber, a night watchman who slept through the first half hour of it. By the time anyone raised the alarm, the eastern storage bay was fully involved. She lost 4 wagons, a winter's worth of stored cargo that was not fully insured, and the roof over the loading dock. She was at the warehouse by the time they got the fire under control. She stood in the dark in a coat she'd thrown over her nightgown, watching the roof timbers collapse, doing the calculation in her head. She could absorb this. She could absorb this if she restructured the spring contracts and had the roof rebuilt before the thaw. It would be tight. It would require her to call in every favor and renegotiate every rate she'd held firm on for 2 years. It was solvable, probably. She was still standing there when Everett came around the corner of the building. She did not understand immediately. She thought she was misreading things in the dark and the smoke. Then he was close enough that there was no misreading it, and she said, "What are you doing here?" And her voice came out far steadier than she felt, which was a habit she'd had so long she no longer controlled it. He said he'd heard about the fire from a freight broker in Billings who'd gotten word from Laramie. He said he drove through the night. He said he came in case she needed help. He said it the way he said everything. Simply, without decoration, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world that a man who had left her employ 3 months ago would drive through a Wyoming January night because her warehouse was burning. She said he didn't have to do that. He said, "I know." She did not cry. She was not built for crying in front of people, and she was not going to start with a smoking warehouse behind her and a man she had driven away standing 6 feet in front of her in the cold. But something shifted. Something that had been held tight since October, since Tuesday, since the door that hadn't been closed moved. She said, "It's bad." He said, "Tell me what you need," she told him. She told him about the wagons and the roof and the contracts and the insurance calculation, and the rate renegotiation she'd need to pull off in 3 weeks, or lose the mining account for good. She told him all of it, the way she hadn't told anyone, not Pettigrew, not her brother, who would have offered to help in a way that felt like taking over. She told Everett because he was standing there in the cold, And he had asked and she trusted his assessment in a way she had stopped trusting most people's. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished he was quiet for a moment and then said the roof was the solvable part, that he knew a crew in Casper who could have it closed before the thaw if she contracted them in the next week. He said the Whitmore brothers out of Douglas had 2 wagons sitting idle since their operation contracted, and might sell at a price she could absorb. He said the mining account was the one to protect first. Everything else could wait. Every piece of it was right. She knew it was right the way she knew when a route change made sense, before she had verified it, with the immediate certainty of someone who has been doing the work long enough to feel the logic before she can explain it. She said, "Why did you come back?" He said, "I told you. I heard about the fire." She said, "That's not what I mean." He was quiet for a moment. The warehouse was still smoking behind her. It was cold enough that she could see his breath. He said, "I didn't leave because I wanted to go to Montana." She said she knew that. He said, "I left because I didn't know how to stay without saying something you weren't ready to hear, and I wasn't willing to stand in your office and pretend otherwise. I don't do well with pretending." She thought about Carol, who had been very good at pretending, who had wrapped every preference and expectation in the language of concern, and had never once said directly what he wanted. Because saying it directly would have required her to answer directly. And that was not a conversation he wanted to have. She thought about Everett, who had stood in her office and asked her what she actually wanted to say, who had not made it a question with a trap in it, who had just asked. She said, "I owe you an answer to a question you asked me in October." He looked at her. She said, "I wanted to say that you were the best hire I'd made in 4 years and I didn't know what to do with that, so I made your life difficult instead and I'm sorry for it." He said, "Wasn't all of it?" She said, "No, it wasn't." He waited. He was very good at waiting. She had noticed this about him from the beginning, that he could be still in a way that wasn't passive, that there was something patient in it but not soft, and it had irritated her once and now it did not. She said, "I wanted to say that I was afraid, that I had built something, and I didn't want anyone close enough to it to change what it was. And then you came in and drove the worst route and fixed things without being asked and read Aurelius in your saddlebag, and treated everything I built like it was worth building, and I didn't know what to do with that either." He said, "So you reviewed my logs?" She said, "I reviewed your logs." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sylvia, I drove the northern route because I wanted to earn my place here. I fixed the equipment because it needed fixing. I never wanted to change what you built. I wanted to be useful to it." She had known this. She had known it and been afraid of it anyway. Which was the part that was hardest to admit. That the fear had not been rational. That she had looked at a man who treated her work with respect, and her judgment with trust, and the whole of what she had made with straightforward regard, and she had been afraid of exactly that. She had been so careful with herself for so long, that she had nearly mistaken care for wisdom. She said, "The position's still open, if that's what you're asking," he said. "I'm not asking about the position," she said. She knew that too. The cold that night was the kind that gets into your coat and stays. She was standing in the remains of a fire in a nightgown she'd forgotten about and her fingers were stiff, and the eastern bay of her warehouse was open to the January sky, and none of it felt as bad as it had 20 minutes ago. When she was standing there alone he stayed. Not because she offered him his job back, though she did, and not because the Montana position had not worked out, though it hadn't, not quite. He stayed because she asked him to, and because asking was the thing she had spent 8 months refusing to do, and when she finally did it he did not make her say it twice. They rebuilt the eastern bay before the thaw. He contracted the Casper crew. She renegotiated the mining account at terms that came out better than what she'd had before, because she had leverage she hadn't used and Everett pointed out she wasn't using it. He said it the way he said everything useful, without making it feel like instruction, without making it feel like anything other than 2 people looking at a problem from the same side of the table. She had never had that before. She had not known until she had it, how much she had been working around the absence of it. They married the following spring. Small, practical ceremony at the courthouse in Laramie, 2 witnesses, no party. Sylvia wore the same coat she'd been wearing the night of the fire because it was still cold. And she was not sentimental about ceremony, only about certain things that mattered, and the ceremony was not one of them. What mattered was the ride back afterward, when Everett drove and she sat beside him going over the spring contracts and he said, without looking up from the road, that she had undersold the Eastern rate by about 4%, and she said she had done it deliberately to build goodwill with the Cheyenne broker for the fall. And he said he hadn't thought of that, and she said she knew, and both of them were quiet for a while, and both of them were content. They ran the Broken Bow together for 27 years. Sylvia managed the contracts and finances and grew the operation until it had roots in 4 territories. Everett managed the drivers and the roads, and never once suggested she was doing anything in a way that could be done better by someone with less initiative and more deference, which had been the implicit suggestion of every man before him. they disagreed constantly, about rates, about expansion, about the right moment to take on risk, about whether coffee should be made strong or stronger, and both of them found the disagreement clarifying in a way that silence had never been. They had 2 children, a daughter who grew up to read everything in the house, and then leave for the university in Colorado, and a son who learned the routes before he learned to read and stayed. Both of them, in different ways, grew up understanding that the work their parents did together was not one person's enterprise and the other's assistance. It was just work, shared and equal, and better for it. Sylvia kept the ledger from the year of the fire, the one where she could see, in her own handwriting, where she had started reviewing Everett's logs more carefully than necessary. The neat columns where she had gone looking for something to find because finding something was easier than saying something. She kept it not as a punishment but as a reference. A reminder that she, who had built a freight operation from 6 wagons to 40 by trusting her own judgment, had nearly undone everything that mattered by trusting her fear more than her instincts. She told her daughter once, when her daughter was old enough to ask about the early years, "If you're looking for reasons to hold something at arm's length, you'll always find them. The question is whether you're looking because you're being careful or because you're being afraid. There's a difference and you'd better know which one it is before you start reviewing the logs." Everett died in 1924 at the age of 61. Sylvia lived to 1938. She was 75. After he was gone, she kept driving the northern route herself, twice a year, spring and fall, long after most people thought she should have stopped. When her son asked why she still made the trip, she said she wanted to see the crossing, the one Everett had found when the old one washed out in the spring of their first year. The crossing no one else had thought to look for, the one she had said she'd take his word on. She'd never told him she'd finally gone to look at it, that she'd stood at the edge of it one April afternoon and understood why he'd chosen it. The solid ground, the angle of approach, the way the far bank gave you room to come up steady with a loaded wagon. Good judgment made visible in the landscape. His kind of thinking, which was the same as hers, which was why she'd been afraid of it. She stood at that crossing every spring for 14 years after he died, and she never found a better one. I've told a lot of stories from the frontier years. I've read a lot of letters and ledgers and courthouse records, and I've come to believe that the hardest thing is not the weather or the miles or the years when nothing works. The hardest thing is recognizing what you have while you still have time to say so. Sylvia Crane almost didn't. She was smart and capable and certain about most things, and she was so practiced at holding herself together that she mistook it for holding herself back, and for almost a full year, she looked for reasons where she should have been looking for something else entirely. She found it. That's the part that matters. Tell me, have you ever been so careful protecting something that you almost protected yourself right out of what you actually wanted? Leave a comment below. I read every one, and if this story stayed with you, there's another one waiting right here. About a man who came back to a place he'd left, and found it had kept something for him.